We're now going to investigate and examine the history of slavery in the United States. Sit tight, there's a lot to unpack here, and some of this can be kind of difficult to learn about. So get ready. Here we go. Slavery in the North. Okay, it's not so bad yet. In the North, they were starting to realize that maybe they didn't really need slavery as much. Hey, that's kind of nice. And the reason for that is because they relied less on agriculture. Their farms were much smaller, and instead they were more industrialized. They worked in factories, and they actually did this crazy thing. They hired people, like they paid them to run their machines in the factories instead of forcing them to work for free like slavery does. So by the year 1820 in the northern United States, slavery was actually outlawed in every state in the north of the United States. So that means slavery has become illegal by the year 1820 in the north. So that's pretty good news that it eventually happened, right? The South is another story. You see, in the South, they were what's called an agrarian economy, meaning they relied on farmland, right? That's how they made money, was through farming. And so their plantation owners forced enslaved people to work in very large fields. Some plantation owners would have hundreds of enslaved people working their fields, right? Then came the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. And what the cotton gin did is it actually made removing the seeds from the cotton fibers easier. Now, normally we think, well, if a machine does the work for us, then we don't need people. So we don't need enslaved labor to harvest cotton, right? Wrong. Because the machine made it so much easier to remove the seed from cotton, now they were able to grow more cotton because a machine could just crank the seeds right out of it. So now that they're growing more cotton, they actually needed more people to harvest the cotton. So then the machine could pull the seeds out of it. So because of that, they needed more and more slave labor in the South. So the South was not going to end slavery anytime soon. Now, we just heard that the North ended slavery by the year 1820, but the reality was that in the North, they had factories that took cotton and made it into clothes. So it was actually the factories in the North that were buying the cotton from the South. So the North was actually supporting slavery because they were buying the cotton that enslaved people were harvesting. So the North wasn't innocent in all of this either. But it is worth pointing out that, yes, the North ended slavery themselves, but they were still supporting slavery by buying the cotton that was harvested on the backs of slaves, right? So then slavery continues to spread as time goes on. By the year 1808, the transatlantic slave trade was actually made illegal. So they no longer can capture people from Africa, put them on slave ships, and sell them as slaves on auction blocks in the United States. That was made illegal. Getting new slaves from Africa was illegal. However, any enslaved people that were currently in the United States, they were still enslaved, and slavery continued within the United States, right? In fact, more than half of the people who moved to the Southwest after the year 1815 were enslaved people. So as the country was growing, more than half of the people that moved into our new territories were enslaved. And by 1820, 95% of the country's African-American population was enslaved. So the real question was, should slavery be allowed in the new territories? As our country is growing bigger, should we allow slavery to spread? You and I know the answer to that is no. But back then, at that point in history, they were still relying on slavery to make their economy in the South work. And as they were spreading to new territories, they wanted to bring their way of life with them. And part of their way of life was slavery. So slaves underwent a lot of brutal treatment. They had to work from sun up to sundown at least 6 days a week. They were given very little food. Sometimes that food wasn't even suitable for an animal to eat. They lived in small shacks with a dirt floor, often with no furniture. You probably been looking at this on the page here. Marriages were not recognized. So if you wanted to get married, you couldn't. And oftentimes those marriages were broken up. If you tried to get married, then the slave owners would actually separate you. Like they would sell husbands away from their wives to go work on other plantations. And children were sold away from their parents. And this is because enslaved people were treated as property. They were not treated as humans. They were treated almost like breeding animals and then being sold to other farms to go work. Okay. Absolutely horrendous the way people were once treated, right? Here's some pictures of some slave cells where some of them were kept before they were sold on the auction blocks before they went to work on the fields. Then something called the Fugitive Slave Law came about. And what this did is it actually required people in the North to return escaped slaves to the South. You see, a lot of enslaved people were running away, thinking they could find freedom in the North because the North had outlawed slavery. But the Southern states wanted their slaves back. And so a law was passed that said, if an enslaved person makes their way up into a northern state, then the northern state has to return that enslaved person to the South. You can't give them their freedom. And this was a law that was passed in the United States. And if they didn't return the slave back to the South, then they would have to pay fines or maybe even be put in jail. Of course, in the North, they didn't want to follow this law because they themselves had outlawed slavery. Slavery was done in the North. So they wanted to give people their freedom, but the law said they couldn't. So they kind of just sometimes forgot to enforce the law at times. The state of Massachusetts actually called for it to be nullified, meaning like, let's get rid of this law. Let's end this law. We don't want this law. And 9 northern states passed their own laws to try to undermine the fugitive slave law. They were called personal liberty laws, and that banned the imprisonment of enslaved people who had run away and guaranteed that they would have a trial by jury. Now, unfortunately, what often happened with this is that if they were captured, they maybe would get to have a trial in court, and then they would often be found guilty simply because they were Black and not white, right? So some states in the North were trying to undermine the fugitive slave law by saying, let's at least give them a fair trial, but usually those trials weren't very fair. And then, of course, the Southern states were absolutely outraged that the North was trying to undermine their law, right? They wanted their enslaved people to return back to them. And the North was saying, no, we want to give them their freedom. And so the northern states and the southern states were starting to kind of clash on this issue. Then were the slave codes. And the slave codes occurred because the slaveholders in the South were trying to tighten restrictions on enslaved people to make it really, really clear how they were supposed to be treated. So the slave codes listed the rights of enslaved people and the different ways that they are supposed to be treated, right? And it often applied to free African Americans. So even if you weren't a slave, even if you had your freedom, sometimes the slave codes still applied to you. And they said that enslaved people were considered property. We mentioned this before. They could be awarded as prizes or wagered in gambling or offered as security for loans or given to people as gifts, right? Property is how enslaved people were treated. It was also considered illegal to educate an enslaved person. It was against the law for an enslaved person to learn to read or write. Enslaved people could not hold gatherings without their slave owner present, so they couldn't have a meeting with their friends or with other enslaved people unless their slaveholder was there. If they were ever found guilty of a crime, they could be beaten or even executed. And in 1835, North Carolina became the last Southern state to ban African Americans from voting. I want to point something out. In order to ban a group of people from voting, that means they had the right to vote first, right? And so this was the case in United States history. African Americans actually did have the right to vote for a while. And that right was taken away from them, and it won't be given back to them until after the Civil War, which we'll be examining later on in this class, this trimester. So as you might imagine, enslaved people weren't really excited about being enslaved, so they rebelled in many ways. One of the most common forms of resistance or rebellion was just in the day-to-day things, small acts of rebellion, rather than some big, outrageous event. They just kind of rebelled in subtle, small ways. They might work a little bit slower, or accidentally break some tools and then they can't do the work, or set buildings on fire. That one might be a little bit more extreme. They might pretend to be sick, or in some cases, they would pretend not to understand their instructions. Now, this one was actually dangerous because what that did is it perpetuated the lie that African Americans couldn't be educated. And so as enslaved people were rebelling, they might pretend to not understand. And so that made white society around them believe that, well, African Americans must just be unintelligent, and that's just how they are. So that ended up kind of working against them in some ways. But in the moment, it's all they could do to rebel against slavery. So there you go. Those are some of the truths, pretty upsetting in some ways, about the history of slavery in the United States.